Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody is keeping safe and well. Some of you may have already gone into your office, so I hope you are managing well with that. And some of us are still working from home. So, good afternoon again to those of you in Malaysia and those who are watching or tuning in from the UK. A very good morning. As you know, I'm Jennifer, the BMCC CEO. Welcome to BMCC's CEO Insight series. Today's topic is Leading Through Change with our guest speaker, Nic Chambers, the country head of Michael Page. Our CEO Insight series brings to you CEOs and leaders from the BMCC network, delivering perspectives, experiences, and wisdom for an effective leadership. But before I introduce our esteemed speaker for today, a bit of housekeeping rules as usual. Please, we encourage you to ask as many questions as possible. So please send your questions to the Q&A chat box. It's not a chat box, Q&A function button. If time permits, we will, as much as time permits, we'll try to make it more engaging and answer your questions. Also, during this session, a survey form will be available. We really appreciate if you could take the opportunity to answer the feedback form on the sessions. That will be on the chat box. I'll remind you again shortly. So before I pass the floor to Nic, let me take some time to share about you to our audience. Personally, I've known Nic since I joined the chamber about 3 years ago. I've always enjoyed my conversations with Nic. I found him to be very approachable, someone who's very easy to speak to. And of course, every time I'm speaking to him, it's about talent development and management. Hence, when we asked Nic to speak, without hesitation, he said yes. So that's Nic for you, and a great leader. I mean, from my discussions with him. So Nic, it's really great to have you part of the BMCC member network. That's from us, from the chamber. So about Nic itself, Nic is currently the country head of Michael Page. Nic started his recruitment career in the UK in 2004 before joining Page Group in Perth, Australia in 2006. In the 10 years that followed, Nic has been responsible for leading a number of technical and commercial recruitment teams before making a move to Malaysia. Good choice, with his wife and 2 children. Okay, as I mentioned, he heads Michael Page in Malaysia, day-to-day management of the organization. He also heads Page Resourcing and Page Contracting. With that, I am totally convinced that Nic will share with us valuable insights to think about daily in our leadership roles. So with that, Nic, over to you.
Cheers. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for the kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here today. We've also had quite a long relationship with BMCC. It's normally me on the other side, listening to the webinars and the content that you put online. So to now be doing the presenting, I'll be honest, I was a little surprised when you asked me, but certainly honored all the same. I'm going to share my screen first up, and then we'll get straight into the presentation. So should be able to see my screen now, Jennifer?
Yes.
Great. Well, look, as Jennifer mentioned, so for those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Nic Chambers. I'm the country head for Michael Page here in Malaysia. I've been very lucky to call Malaysia home for the last 5 years now. And although the last 2 have been, certainly very disruptive, they've also been the most rewarding, challenging, and in many aspects enjoyable that I've had from a leadership perspective. I took over the reins of Page Group Malaysia in October 2019, and then within a matter of a few months, there was this thing of COVID talk happening, and at the time, none of us really thought it would impact us anywhere else outside of China, and very quickly we realized that it was going to, and the world has been a very, very different place ever since. as I mentioned at the start, honestly, I was a little bit surprised when Karen and Jennifer asked me to speak today, because you know, I'm not a leadership coach, and personally, I still feel I have, you know, an awful lot to learn about leadership. I think it's a lifelong learning journey that never really ends. So today's more about how we at Page have managed the last 18 months, and we've made some fairly sizable changes to the way that we operate as a business, and how we've led through that period of change. And I think there's three main areas that I've personally tried to focus on, you know, throughout this changing period. You know, the first one is leadership care. And this is an area that, you know, I've really tried to develop myself in, and I've hopefully got some insights which we can share today. Retaining star talent in a world at the moment where we are in a completely talent short market in many sectors within Malaysia, which many people find a little strange to understand how that can be the case when we're in a pandemic and unemployment is reasonably high for Malaysia. But there are certain pockets of the market which are seriously talent short. So how do we retain our best talent? And then the third one is thriving under pressure. And how do we take, you know, what are quite stressful situations, but turn them into opportunities to further to progress, to develop, and be the very best versions of ourselves possible. Now, before I move into the leadership care section, I want to start with a very short story just about my typical morning routine, which I went through this morning as per normal, and it involves me getting my daughter ready for homeschooling, getting her dressed. Now she's 9, you know, I help her get dressed, you know, brush her hair, put in a ponytail when she lets me, and get her ready for our 8 a.m. Zoom call. Now, in part, I do this because I genuinely enjoy that interaction and having that one-to-one time with her. And I'd hope that, you know, she enjoys that time too. And generally, we're normally talking about the latest YouTube star that she's now following. But the other reason why I do it is because it's just become habit. Like I say, she's 9 now. She's more than capable of dressing herself, brushing her hair, and, you know, washing her face. But for me, it's become habit, and it's probably become habit for her as well, in that she's now just used to that process every morning. And I've become very comfortable doing the same things over and over again, and she probably likes it as well. But when I think about leadership, and I relate this back to leadership, I do this completely unconsciously, and I'm almost on autopilot. And, you know, whilst I think there are some, you know, many great habits of the world's best leaders, these are well documented around getting up at certain times, being very routine driven, what have you. But I don't think leadership should be around operating on autopilot. I think it's about consistently evolving and creating, you know, positive change. And what I learned very, very quickly going into this new leadership role was that I wasn't going to be able to lead through the pandemic in the same way that I had led to get there. And it's the classic proverb of what got you here won't get you there. And that was very, very apparent. You know, the world that we were now operating with had changed. And as a result, I found my leadership having to change as well. And from a leadership care perspective, I think that at Page, we've done an awful lot around increasing our employee support programs. We have counseling services, free counseling services, which people have access to. We have flexible working arrangements, which again, I come on to a little bit later on. Around the world, Page offers Page break days, where people can take, you know, 1 day a month off to fully focus on themselves, purely well-being, where we, and in a world of connectivity, we don't want people checking every emails or just checking the WhatsApp group or just finding out what's happening on Teams. It's really important that people can disconnect. So there's lots that we've done around making Page a more enjoyable experience for our employees. But the thing I want to focus on, like I say, is leadership care. Now, one of the big things I noticed when I first went into lockdown was that the difference in my initial engagements with people every single day. Now, what I'd like you to try and visualize is pre-COVID, you had a routine, much like I mentioned before with my daughter. And that pre-office routine was normally getting stuck in traffic, parking the car, grabbing a coffee, going up the elevator, getting to your floor, and you're generally rushing through the office. You're normally going past banks of desks of people, and you're sort of saying, hi, morning, hi, how are you? Good morning, hi, morning, as you get to your desk. Now, what's really interesting is that Harvard researchers pre-COVID felt that the 3 most useless words of communication were, how are you? And I probably agree with that when I look at the date of that quote, March 2019, because I was guilty of going through the office and saying, hi, good morning, but I wasn't really paying attention. I wasn't really listening to how people were. I would hear the response. It would go in one ear and out the other. Now, it's not to say that I didn't care about people. I genuinely believe that I'm a caring person who would put their team first. But the big difference is now is that when we're working from home, we're no longer rushing. We've saved this time from our commute, and we're able to be far more present in conversation with people. And I say, it's not that I didn't care previously, but now when I ask someone, how are you? I'm very much in tune with wanting to know how they are. And I'm a big believer that how are you have now become, I think, three of the most important words in communication. Because as leaders, we have to care about our people. Because if we don't, we are going to end up really struggling to come on to our next point, which is around retaining talent. And what we tried to do is we tried to make sure we're able to connect with the person and not the role. So what I mean by that is, pre-COVID, in a recruitment setting, which is sales driven, typically KPI orientated, set metrics that you have to measure, we were very much focused on the person's role. Jennifer, you operate at this role, your deliverables should be X. But I think that what we realized very quickly is that people were able to cope with different pressures and different circumstances. There were people who were living with families that were able to get through lockdown far easier than someone who happened to be living on their own, for example, that felt that sense of isolation a lot more. So we really tried to make, and I really tried to make a conscious effort to connect with the person and not the role. And a good example of this is where one of our TD managers was having an exceptionally tough time, where both family members or direct family members were affected by COVID, very unwell, lost a direct relative to COVID. And the pressures and the stresses under that individual were far greater than another TD manager that was maybe sat in a different country. And naturally you pull together and you cover the work for the other individual, and you manage the person and the circumstance, not the actual role itself. And I think by doing that, you have this oxygen mask, or I'll come on to that in a moment, sorry, but I think by doing that, you are able to achieve far greater buy-in and trust and respect, both two ways to the individual and also coming back the other way. Now, the other thing around leadership care is caring for yourself. And some people, when I talk about taking care of number one, think this is actually being quite selfish. But during the first lockdown, I really struggled to look after myself. And I was probably too focused on giving and making sure the team were fully okay and operating, had what they needed to operate at the levels that we needed them to. But I found it took a real toll on myself. And what I learned was that you need to take care of yourself, because if you're able to operate at 100% for 70% of the time, I think that is far better than operating at 70% for 100% of the time. And I think it's very commendable of leaders to try and take on more and to not delegate and not to trust the people around them and not to use the team that they have around them, and just try and do more themselves. But all you end up doing is having burnout. And coming back to the oxygen mask conundrum, I'm sure any parent sat on this plane would have, can take themselves straight back to the last time they heard those words. In case of emergency, air masks will drop from your ceiling. If you're traveling with your own mask on before helping others. Now, I really don't like this message. It doesn't sit well with me at all. Like I said, I have a 9-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old son. And there is no way I could ever imagine as a parent putting on my own oxygen mask and taking care of myself before taking care of my children. But obviously there are people that come up with these rules that are far cleverer than me, that are basically saying it is more important that you take care of yourself so you're better equipped to help others. And I think in a family situation, we struggled to, I certainly struggled to imagine myself doing this. But from a leadership perspective, I think it's really important that this is, the leaders take care of themselves first and foremost, because leadership, like I say, is an absolute privilege. And if you need to make sure that you are able to serve the people, because I think leadership is very much about you serving them and not them serving you. It's about how you can serve the people to the best of your ability. So through that first lockdown period, there were lots of positives to take from it, but the biggest positive for me was to make sure that I was taking care of my own health and well-being, because I genuinely really struggled with burnout, and probably the pressures that just came on with being in a leadership role, going through a pandemic, that there really wasn't a rule book to help with. So going through, and I think, the second lockdown was, I think, far easier for people to manage. But I think this last lockdown has been particularly tough for people. It's been almost, 4.5 months now that we've been in lockdown. And certainly the lessons that I learned to taking care of myself through that first lockdown have served me far, far better in this second lockdown. I'd like to think that from a leadership perspective, I've been able to operate far better than what I was during that first lockdown. And part of that is just being a lot more self-aware, knowing when I'm feeling burnout, knowing when I need to take a break, if I'm going to have annual leave. And I think it's far harder for leaders to take annual leave at the moment, because there isn't really anywhere to go. There isn't really anything that you can do. But I found myself making sure I was taking periods of annual leave where I very, very reluctantly tried not to check my work phone for 24 hours, which may not sound difficult, but I find it incredibly tough not to stay connected. But when I do have those moments and those breaks, I know that I come back far more refreshed, recharged, and able to serve my team far more effectively than what I have been able to do previously. So leadership care is something that I think is really, really important. And ultimately, we want to retain our people as best we can. And that brings us on to retaining star talent. Now, I thought I'd give a little bit of an insight into the employment market at the moment, because our purpose at Page is to change people's lives. And we don't necessarily talk about the number of placements we make. We talk about the number of lives that we're changing. And we are operating at record job levels. Page Malaysia at itself is at record headcount levels. We are changing more lives per month than ever before in our 10-year history in Malaysia. And people really struggle to understand how that can be the case, given we're in the back end of a pandemic. And there's a number of reasons for it. I think first and foremost, the economy in Malaysia is very much two-speed. And the speed between the two speeds is getting greater. So there are some functions and roles which talent are really, really struggling to gain employment at. And that is typically your highly repetitive, high volume, low value functions, back office administration functions. Whereas the other end of the spectrum, we have this complete dichotomy whereby Malaysia cannot produce talent quick enough, and that is more around technology and other areas related to technology. Technology is not the only sector doing well, but it's certainly one that is doing very well. And we also have a situation whereby existing companies in Malaysia, let's say within GBS, for example, have seen that their existing functions have been proved to work very, very well in Malaysia. So they're now looking, okay, well, what other value-adding functions can we bring in? We've got finance, technology, HR. Can we bring in procurement? Can we bring in master data management? Can we bring in some regulatory type roles? And then you've also got other other MNCs that are thinking, okay, well, maybe we were going to set up a GBS in 2022. Maybe we'll bring that forward and actually set it up now. So they've been able to use COVID almost as the catalyst for making that decision. So we're seeing new market entrants coming in. But on the talent side, we have this situation whereby up to a third of the market in Malaysia simply won't change jobs right now for fear of being last in, first out. Job security. Job security is extremely high on people's agendas right now, and quite rightly so. So we have this situation where job volume is high, yet availability of talent is low. And that is almost a perfect conundrum for a recruitment company because it all comes down to sourcing talent. So that's partly why we are so busy at the moment and why I think retaining star talent is so important. I think we need to stop looking, and it's not that necessarily everyone is, but talent can sometimes be looked at as a bit of a commodity. And quite often we invest our time outside of our star talent. And the reason being is that the star talent are performing well. They don't necessarily need our guidance. They don't necessarily need our insights, because they are that star talent. But I think the more that we leave them to their own devices, the more disconnected they get, the more isolated they feel, and the more likely they are to look for another home where they may feel more loved. And the saying goes, invest in your best, but very rarely do we do that. Quite often we'll sit there and we'll have a 4 out of 10 performer, and we spend a lot of time in performance management and coaching and developing that 4 out of 10 performer to get them to a 6 out of 10. Well, what would happen if we invested the same time in our star talent, and we could take them from a 9 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10 or a 9.5 out of 10? Would we get a far better return from that individual and be able to retain them more? I generally believe that we would. So I think there's investing in the right areas. Now, trust is a liberating factor, and what I mean by that is throughout COVID, and again, I talk pre-COVID and during COVID. Pre-COVID, I genuinely felt I trusted the team at Page, or at least what I've come to realize now is I trusted people to a certain level. Pre-COVID, we only gave managers and above home access to our system, because the system is our intellectual property, and the database, and if the database was to be ripped off, that's effectively our whole business gone. And I've always sort of wondered, why don't we give everyone access? But we just didn't. It just wasn't company policy. And then we get thrown into COVID, where we have to give everyone home access. And that is where probably the greatest weight was lifted off my shoulder, because ultimately I was forced into fully trustingly, wholeheartedly trusting people. And what you realize is when you fully trust people, they actually give way more back in return anyway. They feel empowered, and you're giving them the tools they need to do the job, a job that they genuinely like, hence why they're with the organization. But trust is a great liberating factor from a leadership perspective. And I think when you are able to demonstrate high levels of trust to your team, you're able to get that trust back in spades as well. So that was probably the biggest, or one of the biggest eye-openers for me, is give people full trust. And you know what? If one person breaks that trust, that doesn't mean you need to change your whole business model and what have you. That just means that someone's made a bad decision. One bad egg, for example, doesn't mean you have to change everything. And I think that we will, post-COVID, continue giving everyone home access, whether you've been with a business 5 years or whether it's day one, just because we now see that is a better way of operating. People first and productivity follows. So this is really interesting. So Bronnie Ware did a huge amount of studies on the 5 regrets of the dying, and there's 2 here that I specifically want to focus on, because I think this is very relevant to Asia. And the first one is, I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. And the reason why I think that's very true to Asia is I interview an awful lot of people who at midpoint through their career decide to have a complete career change. And I often say to them, well, why did you get into law in the first place? Or why did you get into accounting in the first place? And quite often the answer is, well, that's what my parents wanted me to do. So when I was finishing university, that's what my parents wanted me to do. So I think being true to yourself is really important. But the point number 2 is the one I want to sort of speak about a little bit more here as well. I wish I hadn't worked so hard. Now, first time I read that, I was probably a little bit negative around the fact that, oh, well, that just seems a little bit lazy. And why wouldn't you want to work so hard and what have you? But I think from our perspective, and certainly my perspective at Page, is I want people to work really hard, and I want to be the very best versions of themselves, but I don't want them to work so hard that they regret it. I want them to work hard in an environment they genuinely enjoy being, where they feel a sense of purpose, they feel rewarded, and they get genuine satisfaction from the job that they do. And I think if you're able to create an environment where you're putting people first, the productivity will follow. So again, a very big game changer for me was looking at my role and the hours that I worked, and the role that my wife plays. She works full time, and the hours that she works, and us both having to juggle homeschooling. So again, pre-COVID, I was very routine. I didn't like being in the office after 8. I didn't like leaving the office until after 6. I certainly wouldn't do the school pickup unless I absolutely had to at 3 o'clock, because that's when I had to be meeting with candidates and meeting with clients. And it's not that that's right or wrong. That was just my understanding of what I should be doing at the time. I've since come to realize that that probably isn't the best way to operate. And I now find that instead of myself working, a lot harder during set periods throughout the day, my day sometimes might start at 5 in the morning. If I randomly wake up at 5 in the morning and I can't get back to sleep, I know that I've got 2 hours to get some work done before I then have to help get the kids ready, homeschooling. And then I might not do any more work until midday. And I might get a couple more hours done until I have to do some homeschooling in the afternoon. And then I might not get any more work done until 7 in the evening. So I still produce the same amount of work per day, per week, per month. But what I found is that it's spanned across a far longer portion of the day. Now, I'm not sure if anyone else is on Microsoft 365, but every month I receive a My Analytics email from Microsoft that tells me who my top 5 collaborators are. They tell me how many rest days I've had throughout the month. They tell me how often I'm working throughout the day. I went into my deleted items and I found some emails from the start when My Analytics first came out. And I was very, very productive between the hours of 8 and 6. And there was very, very little email engagement or collaborating with anyone else outside of those hours. Now, if my boss looked at my time I was working between those hours, they might not think I'm working particularly hard, because I've noticed that I actually now do more work between the hours of 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. than I do between the hours of 8 a.m. and 12 p.m. So I've had to completely restructure my day to suit my situation. But what I've found is I'm still able to be productive. And another great example of this is we just had our August wrap up. So talking about the best performances in August and how we performed. And year to date, 4 of our top 5 fee earners at Page, top 5 recruiters, are working mums. And I sit there thinking, that is a phenomenal achievement when you're able to balance being a working parent. And it's not just they're working mums in this situation, but they're working parents are able to juggle performing to that level of performance. And we have 80 plus people in our office in Malaysia. But I'm extremely inspired by these 4 individuals who are able to perform to these levels consistently every single month throughout the year, whilst having children to homeschool, families to look after. Some of them live with their grandparents and in the same house. It's not easy, but they're able to prioritize their work. And I got them to run a session on managing your time effectively for 7 new starters that we've recently had joined. And people struggle to understand how they can do the job and also be a parent. But one of the things they made is, well, I've just had to change my day, and I work at different times and what have you. And even though what we found is that technology is a great enabler, which helps, but people are actually probably working slightly less hours at the moment. But we have seen an 18% in productivity from 2000. So we compared 2019 to 2021. So an 18% increase in productivity. So even if people are working effectively a 4-day week, they're still operating to the same levels of 2019. Now, part of that is that they're 2 years better at doing their job. They're more experienced. Part of that is that technology does enable them to do their job better. But also people feel more loved within the business. They feel more cared about. They know that their well-being is of the utmost importance. If they need to take a rest day, they're encouraged to take a rest day. And as a result, people are operating at 100% for 70% of the time versus 70%, 100% of the time. So we've noticed a real big a connection between leadership care and retaining our staff talent. And they know that the business cares first and foremost about their well-being. And as a result, they are willing to and are able to operate at a far higher level. So I think this I wish I hadn't worked so hard. It's really, really important to make sure that people don't work so hard and regret it. It's about working hard but enjoying what they do. And I think this, that last point is just around, the more that you're willing to give as an employer, I think the more that you're going to get back as well. So certainly that's been my modus operandi moving throughout this year. So in terms of thriving under pressure, I thought what we could do here is actually just use the chat function, because I'm really interested just to understand what people's thoughts are on the top 1 or 2 aspects of work that create pressure for people. So if you're happy to, and you're able to open the chat function, I'd love you just to throw some comments in there in terms of what creates pressure for you as an individual. See if anyone's keen to share something. Jennifer, what creates pressure for you in your daily life?
I think in the past, it was the deadlines. When the deadlines get nearer and nearer, and then suddenly you have to have firefighting kind of issues popping up, that creates pressure. And now it's more of trying to manage, manage a lot of things happen at the same time. And thanks for recognizing all the working moms there. I'm one working mom. And sometimes I think managing is much better now, but the pressure comes when there's so many things to do. And sometimes I just have to take a break and, relax. So pressure comes when there's everything, home, work, and crisis. Every day you have crisis. Yeah, that's me. Let's see others.
So we've got numerous meetings in a day and too many tasks all at once that creates pressure. And I think that they're really valid points. And I think that when we're working from home, you get these very blurred lines between work and home, because it's the same 4 walls all the time. And what happens is many leaders then think that, well, the person's at home, they're working from home, they must be working, which means people then become accessible 24/7. Now, one of the things I've had to do is I put on my emails, when I'm trying to clear emails, I put on my emails in big capital letters, no need to respond now. These are the times that I work. I don't expect anyone else to be working, but I know that if I don't clear through emails there and then, I just won't get them answered. Now, the frustrating thing for me is, and maybe I need to learn how to send emails on certain times so only arrive in people's inbox the next morning. But I do know that if I send an email out, people will read it. But my team generally now know that there is no expectation for them to respond. I'm not expecting a response at 11 at night. That works for me. And what may work for me may not work for someone else. But we end up with these very blurred lines where people will feel, well, I'm at home, so I must be working. And in one sense, that's part of the reason why productivity has gone up, because people are, I think, working slightly longer hours. But you then have a situation where multiple tasks and multiple meetings come through at once. I mean, how many times have you gone from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting? I mean, you would never do that when you're working in the office, because it's just physically not possible. You've normally got a break between meetings where you're driving to the next location, or you're driving, or you're going get your lunch or whatever it might be. But I look at my diary now and I'll have 4 meetings back to back over 5 hours, and that is not healthy. Okay. So in terms of thriving under pressure, there are things that we can do in our control to alleviate some of that pressure. But I think what's also important to understand is pressure will always be there. Pressure was here from a leadership perspective before COVID. It was there during COVID, and it will be here after COVID. So I think there will always be underlying pressures, whether it's that someone in your team's resigned and it was completely unexpected, and that's left a really big gap in your team. It might be that a contract that you thought was going to get renewed hasn't been renewed, and then you've got to think about how you're going to recuperate that revenue. I think what's been slightly more challenging for the last 18 months or so is that the pressures that we've been dealing with have probably been a little bit more unique in nature, given there wasn't a rule book for this entire working from home. But I think that certainly in Malaysia, companies have been very, very adaptable and have actually shown huge amounts of resilience in order to move an entire workforce online. Frustrations in dealing with others, and particularly government agencies online and working from home. Look, Look, in some senses, yes, I can understand where you're coming from there. I think in some aspects, we have to take our hat off to Malaysia, especially from the vaccine rollout process. I think that has been exceptional. But I think the reality is what we're saying there is that it's the grey that people are finding really challenging. It's the unknown. You know, when will kids be going back to school? When will we be moving to phase 3? When can we be doing X, Y, Z? So there is certainly the frustration of the unknown and what have you, and just the not knowing, and then the miscommunications piece is very, very true. You know, technology, never before has technology been such a good enabler for communication. Yet I genuinely do think that when times get tougher, we become more and more siloed around just focusing on what we need to be doing, and we forget about communicating and collaborating and networking on a wider scale, which at the moment we should be doing that even more, is collaborating and networking and leveraging off each other and understanding what is best practice in your location. How can we be adapting to thrive under pressure more? Managing the different level of expectations from higher ups and the working level. Again, I think all that comes down as well to that leadership care piece, and you know, creating an environment of trust. And you know, I don't look at my team's KPIs week to week to week, because I appreciate that, and I have the exact thing. I have good weeks and I have bad weeks. Leaders aren't you know, superheroes who don't feel the effects of COVID and don't feel the effects of the same pressures everyone else does. You know, they still affect us. And you know, I remember during the first lockdown, when I was talking about, I was burnt out, and you know, I was so focused on the team that I wasn't looking after myself. And I remember one of my colleagues that, you know, said, "Nick, I just want to ask, how are you?" And I literally became quite emotional, because it's the first time that someone had asked me, "Yeah, how am I?" And I was like, I'm not great, I'm struggling. But also, I think from thriving under pressure, leaders have to be vulnerable, and they have to be authentic, and you have to be willing to acknowledge when you're having good days. Because if you want people to be authentic, and if you want people to seek help when they need it, and people's well-being at the moment is generally getting worse and worse. You know, I really do think that we have a employee assistance program. It's completely confidential. All I get is stats on the number of people using the platform, and those stats are increasing, which on one hand is good. People are using what is available to them, but it's a worry to me that I genuinely feel we're managing or trying to manage this as best as we can in terms of people's well-being, yet people are still struggling. So I think if leaders want people to be honest, if leaders want their people to be honest about how they're feeling, we as leaders have to be vulnerable enough to be honest about how we're feeling as well. So I'm open with my team if I'm having a good week or bad week. So like I say, I don't check their performance week to week. They'll have good weeks, they'll have bad weeks. So I think managing those different levels of expectations and higher up, that just comes from trust. And that comes to how trusting the relationship is between management and the business, but also from the business and management as well. I just need to click out of this to get back to the slides. Okay, one moment. So what causes us to experience pressure? I think we just answered some of those, and I think those causes change all the time. But I think what is really, really important is that we have to be willing to not just accept change and pressure, but also in some instances incite it ourselves. And again, there's a really interesting story about one of the world's largest power station companies who I don't need to share the name of, but it's a really, really interesting little story. In the late 90s, they were the world's leading builder of power stations. And if, let's say, I don't know, in the late 90s, 100 power stations were built, they had about 85% market share. So they were responsible for building 85 of the world's 100 power stations. And that's been the case for 100 years. And then what started to happen is that as they were getting better and better and better at building power stations, yes, power stations were becoming more and more efficient, which meant the power stations went from 100 power stations per year to 80. So they were building less power stations per year, but they still had about 85% market share. And so they're building about 64 per year now. And this continued and continued and continued until the early, maybe 2012, where the world was only building 5 or 6 power stations per year. You then had nuclear, you then had solar, you had a lot more green energy coming in. And the board was so focused on market share still being 85% that they just ignored the fact that their revenues had been dropping. And as a result of their revenue being dropping, they'd had been having to let go of people. They'd been having to lose some really, really good talent. But they were still focused on the fact that we still have 85% share of the world's global power station builds. And what had been happening is their competitors who'd been trying to compete with them for so long had realized, well, there's no point trying to compete with them anymore, because they're always going to be the world's leaders. And what they did is they pivoted their business. They were willing to blow up their business. And this is a really interesting story. You have to be willing to blow up your own business for the greater good, because if you don't, someone else will. And that's what the disruptors of the world come in. And what they did is they decided, well, we're no longer going to worry about these 3-year build projects that you're winning all the contracts for. We're going to focus on the 30-year maintenance contracts, because they're far more lucrative. And what we're going to do is all that talent that you had to let go because your revenues were dropping, we're going to hire those people because they were the ones that built the power plants in the first place. So we can now go to the owners of these power plants and say, we want to win this contract with you, 30-year contract, and we're going to bring you the team that actually built that power station. And that contract's going to be worth 10 times as much over 30 years. And what happened was that these 2 or 3 competitors who were always struggling to scrap over 15% market share were able to take a far smaller percentage of a far bigger pie. So what sometimes businesses have to look at is not look at how do they expand their existing pie, but also what other pies are they able to add on as well. And if I look at what we were doing in Michael Page going into COVID, we recognized that the existing portion of the business was going to slow down. We could see the job numbers dropping quite dramatically. And it would only be external factors generally that would lead to those markets coming back, which was business confidence improving, consumer spending improving, people being willing to change jobs. So I thought, okay, well, how else can we protect our revenue line? We need to look at new markets. So what could we be doing that we're not doing in Malaysia? So we launched our contracting business, and everything that we hear about Gen Z and the gig economy and technology points towards contracting. So we launched a contracting business. We also looked at what trends did we see past after the first global financial crisis? We saw a lot more functions being outsourced in the first 2 to 5 years post the global financial crisis. People wanted to focus on their core business, so they outsourced non-core functions to someone else. So we launched our outsourcing business with our RPO business. And certainly our RPO business and our contracting business is following suit, are 2 exceptionally busy businesses for us right now, and very, very important. The shape of our business would be very, very different had we not just looked at expanding our existing pies, but also looked at new businesses as well. And I think the example of always just looking at one metric being market share can be very, very dangerous. So we recognize that if we're gonna not just survive in this era, if we're gonna really thrive, we have to be willing to blow up our existing business, not just do things the same way, but also look to do things very, very differently. And thankfully, we had people within the business who are willing to take those risks and make those changes and step out of their comfort zone. And it's just as well that we did, because the business now is in an extremely healthy position as a result of making those quite radical changes 18 months to 2 years ago. And that's that threat versus opportunity. We were very much sat there in a situation of threat. The recruitment is predominantly driven by external factors, which is, as I mentioned before, consumer confidence, business confidence, hiring confidence. We can have the best recruitment team in the world, which I think we do, albeit I'm slightly biased. But if 0 companies are hiring, we can't operate. So we have to look at the threats and how can we turn those into opportunities. And I think that's something that, looking back, we can be exceptionally proud of that we were able to do. And as I mentioned before, accept change, but also instigate it. There are many, many changes that businesses have had to bring about for the good as a result of COVID. But how many CEOs and how many leaders would have been brave enough to make those decisions had it not been for COVID? And I think moving out of COVID, in terms of leading through this new normal, which I don't think there's gonna be anything normal about it. I think it's gonna be ever changing and ever evolving. I think coming out of this period, we have to be willing to continue to change, but also, like I say, not just change because we're forced to, but be willing to instigate that change and be brave enough to make business decisions that you might fail, that may not succeed, but you're giving yourself an opportunity to grow, develop, and progress as an organization. I think leaders who are brave enough to make those decisions are the ones who then thrive, opposed to simply just getting through a period of time. That's me, Jennifer.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I think I can resonate so much with some of the things that you have said, and really, excellent insights. And let me go back to the audience. If those who are watching, if you have any questions, please do ask. And before we take on, I see there's one question popped up. But before we take on, I will ask you some questions first. I have my own questions that I've set.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you, as leaders, I trust all of us have learned so much in the last 18 months. Every day, changes happening in 18 months. So if from your own experience, right, how well will you be prepared to deal with such an unexpected disruption, such as what the pandemic has brought to us, right? Overnight, we all went work from home. And how well will you be more prepared, or will you be prepared to deal with such an unexpected disruptions in the future from all the lessons that you've learned over the months?
Yeah, I think there is no substitute for experience. That's the reality. And I remember going through the global financial crisis. I maybe had been with Paige for 2 or 3 years, and I was the only one globally leading a mining and resources team. We didn't have mining resources anywhere else in the world. Perth being Western Australia, heavy mining, and we built this team to about 16 people. And within a month, every single client had practically stopped hiring because the commodity prices crashed. No one was mining, and we were in a very, very, very poor space. And I did not know how to react. I didn't have anyone to turn to, and I didn't know what to do. And I remember this feeling of just spiraling out of control, when no matter what I did, was able to improve the performance of the business. And then you do have to make decisions and what have you. Now, I learned a huge amount from that process. I didn't realize I would, and I didn't think that I would take that experience with me. But coming into the pandemic, very, very quickly, we were able to identify the other parts of the business that we felt could grow and could keep us afloat. So technology. Let's look at the data. I think data has played a big part in making business decisions. So we looked at parts of the business where job flow had slowed the quickest, and we reallocated resources into technology, where we could see that job flow wasn't growing. It was still declining, but it wasn't declining as much. So we were able to make those business decisions quickly rather than procrastinating, which I think I did last time. So I guess where I'm going with this is that I think if we got into another situation around a form of pandemic or a global crisis, the lessons learned through this crisis will without doubt help to get through that period. Just simply from what we've learned and been through, and having come out the other side as well.
Okay, thank you. I have actually a good question here from Rafiza. She's asking, how do you manage if your values does not align with your leaders?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really important question, and I think the values. Part of the reason why I've stayed with Paige for as long as I have is, well, there's multiple reasons, but I genuinely buy into the values of the business, and I'm very, very pleased that the values of our CEO and the board are very much aligned to my values. And I think that finding a values-driven company that's aligned to your values is really, really important. And the first thing I'd say is that you have to communicate with your leader. And there's nothing, people often think that communicating up often means conflict, and I don't think it needs to be. And I think being open to having a conversation with a leader around what your values are and how they may not be as aligned needs to happen. Now, I'm always reluctant to give this advice because people sometimes just think, well, you're just saying that because you work in recruitment and you need to change, you're giving me advice to change jobs. That's not the purpose of this. But I do think that if you're finding that your values aren't aligned to an organization or to a leader, and you've had the conversation and you haven't been able to change that, then you need to find an organization that is aligned to your values. So like I say, not giving that advice and feedback because of the industry I work in, but I just think it's really important. You get one opportunity in life, and it's really important that people make the most of that opportunity. And like the point, the 5 regrets of the dying, you know, don't regret working so hard in a job that you didn't enjoy and love and were passionate about, with people that you cared about, that inspired you, and hopefully you inspire them as well. And I think finding that business that is aligned to your values is really important.
I agree, Nic. Nic, I have a question here. Actually, this is something that I think a lot of leaders go through. Giving constructive, you know, you really value your talent, but however, sometimes we need to give constructive criticism. And I think it's even more difficult in a digital world, giving back feedback, you know, without appearing harsh, because you don't get to see the body language and everything. So, you know, how do you do it? You know, maybe you can share with us, or, you know, share good examples. How do you offer some suggestions or give constructive criticism remotely?
It's interesting that the word is constructive criticisms, because straight away there's a negative connotation on criticism, right? But it doesn't necessarily need to be criticism. And I think all too often people are so worried about giving feedback that they wait until a formal period, like an end of year review process or a quarterly review process. But I also believe, and again, it comes back to genuinely to trust, right? If I felt I could give someone feedback, or someone give me feedback that would make me operate at 1% better, I would want that person to tell me, and I'd want them to feel, you know, confident that the team can come to me and give me that feedback, knowing that I'm not going to scold them or tell them, you know, that it's going to affect their performance or their bonus or whatever it may be. Because ultimately, if I can be a better leader and lead people better, they're going to stay with the business longer, which means we're going to be in a healthy position anyway. But I think that as leaders, you know, we have to be willing to give constant communication. And quite often what happens is that someone doesn't perform to the level you want them to. So you leave it, let it go. No, they might improve. And then you very quickly realize they're not going to improve. So instead of you nipping it in the bud, you know, that little molehill's now become a mountain you now need to tackle. And part of that is just because of not communicating. And, you know, there's lots of ways that you can deliver feedback. There's feedback frameworks in terms of how you can deliver feedback, which are very, very useful. I've used them myself in the past to help give feedback. But ultimately, it's about giving feedback in a constructive manner, that the individual receiving that sees it as a development opportunity. But then what I try and do, and I use my diary to make lots of little notes, is, let's say I had to give you feedback, Jennifer, on your conversion rate of client meetings, calls to client meetings, and there is an improvement. I will diarize a note to check in a month's time to see how you're performing. And if there's an improvement, it's about following up then, say, hey, Jennifer, look, we had that conversation a month ago about improving your conversion of calls to client meetings. Really pleased to see that it's going up. Like, well done. Have you noticed a difference? Are you finding it better? So I think if you're willing to give feedback, if you feel it's important enough to give feedback, I think it's even more important to follow up on how they've actually been able to do anything with that feedback. Now, you might find that they haven't improved, so you have to give some additional coaching and what have you, and some development. But I think it's all about how you deliver it and how you interpret it as it being development, not criticism.
That's very difficult in the digital world.
It is. It's harder because you don't get that that sense of body language and engagement. But again, I think if there's trust there, the person knows that you're giving that feedback for the right reasons and not just for the sound of your own voice. But I also do think, Jennifer, that some people use the digital world as sometimes an excuse not to give feedback, because you are inherently worried yourself about how the other person might feel. So you don't give them the feedback. But all you're doing is you're doing them a disservice, because as a leader, you owe it to them to give them that feedback. That's what's really, really important. When you're giving feedback, it's less about how it makes you feel. It's more about how you can improve the performance of the other person.
Yes, thanks, Nic. I think that's a valuable comment to give for all of us who go through that, especially. Before I take on the next question to the participants, could you kindly give us your feedback on our event, and be constructive on good things too, good and
Absolutely.
Where we can improve. Yes. I think there's another question from Phoebe. Phoebe is also from my team, and she asked, people have had the opportunity to work remotely. How do you envision the future of workplace evolving?
Yeah, I think it's really, really interesting, and I don't necessarily have the answer. What I would say is I do think it depends industry to industry. I effectively work in a sales environment where people tend to be a little bit more, not complete extrovert, but more towards the extrovert, where I feed off other people's energy. I feed off seeing the team support each other through good times, through bad times. And that's really what I miss. I can still engage with people. I miss that people engagement face to face. So when we do the surveys around return to work, we get a very high score of people wanting to be back in the office. But I do get quite frustrated on LinkedIn when I see these polls. How many days a week will you work? Will it be 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? Because my answer is, well, it's going to completely depend week to week. Some weeks I might work in the office 5 days a week. I might do that for 3 weeks running. Then the next week I might choose to work 1 day in the week. But what we want to create at Page is complete flexibility, where there isn't a set structure where you must work X days. It is work the days that work for you. Now, if that means some weeks it's 3 days, 2 days, 1, no problem at all. The metrics in terms of what's expected of you in your job doesn't change, whether you're at home or in the office. We're able to run board meetings, manager meetings, remotely, half remotely, people in the office, people at home with the technology we have. So that's not a problem. But people have to work day to day in the environment where they feel most comfortable and where they feel they can be most efficient. And if someone's got a sick son or daughter and they were going to work in the office, but they're not going to work in the office, okay. If someone wants to go and work in a cafe, I'm okay with that, as long as they're doing the job. So I think there will be a real hybrid. I think we'll still see a mix of people working from home, depending on their situation. I do think there will be a stronger return to work at some point. I don't think it'll be immediate, but I think at some point people will end up just feeling more comfortable being back in the office and what have you. Because I think there is a safety aspect to that at the moment as well, where people just don't want to travel public transport right now. But I personally don't think COVID's going away. I think we'll become more and more resilient to living with it and working with it. I think that'll be reflected in our the way that we work and embrace the workplace as well. So who knows? We'll see.
Yes. Yes. I think, we don't know. Things change and it all depends. I agree with you. We don't know what kind of flexible work arrangement actually works. And really, it also depends on large organizations, small organizations. I guess we have to learn as we go along, because one size may not fit all. Everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the one thing we can do is trust. Trust is ultimately the key. Trust your people to do the job that's expected of them, regardless of what time they do it or where they do it from. And I think if you give people that ownership and flexibility, like I say, you'll get far more back in return anyway.
Yes, I agree. So, Nic, is there any, apart from that's nice concluding words that you have said, but is there anything more, because we are coming to the hour already? And as I said, time passed fast. I do have a number of questions, but I think you've given an overall very comprehensive and things. Some of these things that we are aware, but it's good to hear it out loud and try to implement. I think one thing that came on strong to me is that investing in the star talent. Sometimes we spend so much of time in trying to improve the person who's not working well, and we forget about the star talent because we know that person can be. And the other thing is that we as leaders, I think the same thing, we are also going through the same issues as our team members. And it was nice, someone asked us, how are you doing? It happened the same thing to me when one of my board members, Jen, how are you doing? We're always asking everyone how you're doing. So I think a lot of leaders out there who are leaders, senior managers, or even many managers, they have found whatever you said, would have found whatever you said valuable and something that we can actually take back and think about it. But before I close, any final words before I did do some announcements?
No, I just think exactly that. Trust your people, care for your people, give them the autonomy, the responsibility, the headroom to grow. And I think when you give people the opportunity to show their potential, they can do some pretty magical things. So, and look after yourself first and foremost.
Yes, correct. Look after yourself, ladies and gentlemen. So with that, Nic, look after yourself too. Thank you so much for being here with us. And thank you for all your sharing, open sharing. And we will be in contact with you. And do reach out to us if you need to talk to us. Right? Thank you. But before we leave, I think my colleague has some slides to show just for the audience. Just a gentle reminder for the BMCC members. This is for BMCC members only. Our AGM is coming up soon on the 23rd of September. We need your support to sign up. If you're a member of the chamber, please do sign up. And just wanted to highlight, we are so proud to this year organize Malaysia Climate Action Week together with the British High Commission. If you're interested to know more about it, how you can be involved, do reach out to us. Be part of this journey with the BMCC and our members. And always keep updated to our BMCC newsletter and our social media sites. And remember to give us your feedback. So with that, thank you very much, everyone. Nice to be speaking to you again. Keep in touch and stay safe. Take care.